Bye-bye. Okay. Well, thank you, Patrick and Biju, for organizing this. So nice to see old friends and make new friends and have the opportunity to continue to discuss these ideas. So I'm going to begin by reflecting a little bit on the provocation, something Patrick said in passing about this being a follow-up to the Empowered Deliberation workshop that took place in Wisconsin in 1999 or 2000. Archon will remember. All of us have gotten older except him for some reason. But I want to reflect about that because actually that talks to some of the issues and some of that are actually on the table. So some of the things that I've been listening to today that I think will be important for you editors, or maybe for all of us, there's a few things we are debating or discussing or coming to different conclusions on. One is this issue of success. What is a success? People are talking about successful, but it's really quite whose success, what do we mean by it? Certainly something to put on the table. This issue of context, enabling context, constraining context. Do we talk about context at all? There's the issue of transplants. This was in Michael's paper. This is going to be in my paper to some extent, and it was certainly part of your paper earlier, the idea of a deliberative project being taken somewhere. And something that came up in the last in JP's presentation, which is everywhere in the papers too, is this issue of scale somehow. Jenny was making these remarks earlier about the relationship between deliberative and aggregative institutions, but there's something going on here about scales and different kinds of institutions. Thinking back to the Wisconsin discussion we had 10 years ago, the first two issues, success and context, were certainly on the table, but the latter two, this issue of transplant and scale, were not on the agenda yet, and I think that says something about the moment that we're in. And I have to remark also one big difference, or I have to at least note that the 1999 conference was sponsored by the Haven Center for Radical Scholarship and Social Change, or whatever the Haven Center is. And here we are at the World Bank 10 years later. And I think this is non-trivial. I mean, it's funny, but it's non-trivial. I don't know who has changed. Maybe deliberation has changed. But it's something to think about. And my paper is going to get to thinking about this. So the paper is, I changed the title at the last minute. It's called Who Will Speak for the People? And it's about the translation of participatory budgeting. And to just take you back to the Wisconsin story, at that point in time, I was working on a book which I published, which was about participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre. A relatively successful story that then became a mythical story. Archon was saying earlier, Porto Alegre is not everywhere, but actually Porto Alegre is everywhere. We have something like 1,500 to 2,000 participatory budgets around the world, pretty closely modeled on the Porto Alegre story. Participatory budgeting, for those of you who don't know, is this idea that citizens ought to have a direct input on the making of a municipal budget. It's kind of direct democracy over a simple thing, a particular municipal budget. So it traveled a lot. It moved, and it's national policy in Venezuela, Peru, Dominican Republic. The Labour government in Britain has adopted it. I was happy to hear earlier also this language of the World Bank investing in deliberation. One thing I was doing the last minute of this paper was removing all references to the World Bank promoting participatory budgeting, because when I was here talking to people who work on participatory budgeting, they said, the World Bank doesn't promote participatory budgeting. It doesn't promote anything. But it invests in studies, disseminates, helps capacitate people involved in participatory budgeting. The World Bank has been a big player, we should say, in the diffusion of participatory budgeting in the Andean region. For example, there's a World Bank signature. And participatory budget is now in the United States. We have it in the 49th Ward in Chicago. We're going to start having it in New York beginning this fall, I just heard. So it's traveled a lot. There's something attractive to this idea for sure, and something about this rapid travel resonates with the current moment. It says something about our quick communications for sure. It says something about the new spirit of government. And it might be something, and to quote our illustrious friend Peter Evans, something about counter-hegemonic globalization. This might be a social movement, come leftist party idea, traveling to lots of places and helping people get empowered along the way. But there is something also, there's a critical take on this diffusion of participatory budgeting. And it has a little bit to do with the contradictions that Anne was talking about earlier this morning. So globalization, as we know it now, raises dilemmas between forms and scales of governance and representation. That's Habermas. We live in a moment, again quoting Peter, we have the diffusion of a thin democracy. That is, we have electoral democracy in most countries. It's a sort of hegemonic rule now. But many, many decisions are out of the hands of the demos. So powerful economic actors, in some ways, are more unconstrained than before. So we have this apparent paradox. We have thin democracy, we have hollowed out nation states, and yet we have lots and lots and lots of deliberative democracy. We have so much deliberative democracy. I was recently reviewing a paper, and they were saying, oh, there's so much deliberative democracy, there's a fatigue. There's so much deliberative democracy that there's even a fatigue of the critique of deliberative democracy. That is, there are probably 150 papers, published papers out there that say, we're sick of participatory democracy and we're sick of deliberation because there's so much of it. It's really a phenomenon unto itself. There's so much about it and so much criticizing the stuff about it. But I think there's also evocation of deliberation in many, many quarters. I think there is something distinctive about the current moment. And so in this paper, what I was trying to do is trying to think of deliberative democracy as an object in motion in a world of flows. And let me read you a quote of what I'm not arguing in the paper, which is this. Pablo Leal is actually a friend. He says, participation, for it to become part of dominant development practice, had to be modified, sanitized, depoliticized. Once purged of threatening elements, participation could be re-engineered as an instrument that could play a role within the status quo rather than one that defied it. If you looked at participatory budgeting, there is something to its travel that sort of matches up with that description. That is, it used to be about social transformation and social change, and it slowly becomes about good governance and a technical fix. The kinds of people advocating for it change, but I actually think that if you look closely at the way it lands in different places, this sort of structurally overdetermined story doesn't hold 100%. That is, once you actually look at how it lands, I think the story is actually ambiguous, and I'm going to be both hopeful and skeptical. I argue in the paper that there's two ways that it travels. One way is, again, institutional monocropping, which is blueprintism. There's a blueprint of participatory budgeting that travels, and it lands and it's implemented, and it looks just like this, and this is how you have to do it. There are cases of participatory budgeting that they literally copy the names of all the institutions from Porto Alegre. In the yearly cycle, it starts in March, ends in November. There are cities that, for some reason, this is a true story, that they've divided themselves into 16 districts because Porto Alegre is divided in 16 districts. I mean, it's really like a blueprint. That's one way it travels for sure. Another way, I think, has to do with democratic experimentalism. This is Sable's idea, meaning that people take lessons from other places of what works and what doesn't, and they experiment with it, and they move forward, taking these lessons in some way, learning from them, but not being flattened by them.